You're listening to the Steel and Students podcast, a show that gives an inside look into the steel industry and how to find your career path no matter the field. Hi, I'm Clint.
And I'm Adrienne.
And today we're talking about how not to suck during an interview. Alrighty. Well, this is our re-recording of our How to Not Suck During an Interview. When we did this live, we failed to record our session. So Adrienne and I came back in here into, I think it'll be kind of fun to call it into conference room B, up to speed.
Yeah.
It's where we do our recordings. It's not a studio, it's conference room B.
Yep.
And we're just going to try to rehash. It probably won't be word for word for sure like the original live, but we'll try to hit on all the main points we hit on during the live, and we'll be sure to hit record on our next one. So I thought we'd introduce ourselves. That's what we did last time. I'm going to let Adrienne go first this time.
All right. So hi, I'm Adrienne Lister. I have been working at Gerdau for about a year now. I'm almost to my 1 year mark in a month.
Yeah.
And I went to school at Missouri S&T. I graduated with a degree in ceramic engineering, have a minor in psychology and a minor in engineering management. I currently work here in the product metallurgy department as our management associate. That's our entry-level program that we kind of get a lot of our college students in to whenever they join Gerdau. Liking it so far. Clinton asked me to do this based on some of my college experiences. So,
yeah, I've put Adrienne to the fire. She's already interviewed maybe even some of you that are watching this before at S&T or in other places, and so I thought she'd bring some good insight since she's a recent grad and she's been on both sides of the table within the last year. Within the last year, so I thought that was really good. And then, of course, my name is Clinton Johnson. I've worked here at Gerdau now 7 years, 7-year mark this month. And I was a management associate. I was a recent grad. My undergraduate's in electrical engineering. I started at UA Fort Smith and finished up my degree at the University of Arkansas. And then I went and got my master's in Christian education down in Fort Worth, Texas. A little bit about me, I guess. Outside that, I sit in HR. My title is a management systems facilitator, but I function as the continuous improvement manager or facilitator for our facility. Most manufacturing facilities have a CI person, and that's technically the position I sit, but that's just a small piece of what I do. But since I sit in HR, I get to do recruiting, and
which is fun.
I do enjoy it, and that's what kind of led us to doing this video podcast, these videos and this audio. The idea behind it is that, with the pandemic, and I think even after the pandemic, as Gerdau, we need to find out better ways to stay in touch with college students throughout the year. In an easy and effective way. And we don't want it to just be one-sided where it's just all about Gerdau. Our purpose behind us is empowering people who build the future. And so part of this series, I think, is there's always going to be an element that's selfish, that it's for Gerdau, and there's a little bit of recruiting. But I think the majority of it is going to be working in and learning about either be an advocate for the steel industry on this as well. So we'll kind of get into it. As you can see on the presentation, it's steel students and how to not suck during an interview. So based on a survey that I sent out about a month or so ago, the top requested topic for us to discuss was interviewing and interview skills. And I'll be the first to say that while I would say that we're probably pretty good subject matter experts on interviews, I would say that even if you followed everything we say in this video, you could still not get the job.
Yeah.
And I think that's a reality that I think particularly for more engineering technical people, that there's no magic formula. There's no getting an A or getting 100% in your interview that guarantees the job.
Things happen.
Things just happen, right? And that's okay. But, doing well in an interview is a piece of getting the job. So we want to make sure that you're educated in how to do well in an interview. And I would say that the interview room has changed over the past 10 to 20 years. It's not near as overall intimidating as it used to be. So we'll kind of get into it. Let's go to the kind of our first point. We're going to kind of cover a few topics. You can kind of see the topics through there to kind of keep us on track. But we'll spend a bulk of our time probably on the last kind of couple points there. So let's keep on going, Adrienne. And so, when it comes to interviewing, you want to make sure that you want to interview for a company that you could see yourself being there and that you enjoy. You never want to take the shotgun approach. It's kind of like, I was thinking of this the other day, and we didn't say this in the first one, so kudos to the people that are watching this, is you don't want to speed date or just really try to just date everybody.
Right.
You want to be selective in who you date.
Have a little personal value.
Yes, exactly. You don't want to, I'm trying to think of a better word, but either way, you don't want to just take a shotgun approach to just trying to get a job. You don't want to look desperate, right? I think whether you're a dude or a gal, you don't want to look desperate on the dating scene. Well, you don't want to look desperate on the job hunting scene either. So you need to make sure that whoever you're interviewing with or want to interview with, that you could see yourself being there.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that, because I think that whenever you do take that shotgun approach, that you're kind of being disingenuous with everyone that you're talking to almost. Yes, you may interview with a couple of companies that you really want to work for, and you may interview with a couple of companies that you really don't want to work for, just in case those other two fall through. It's kind of a delicate balance, but I also think that in the end, do you want to work for the company that you may not be as interested in at all? What about it interests you? I think that's something that people that are interviewing need to kind of figure out before they take the interview almost, even. Because if you are going to you don't want to be wasting their time. You don't want to be wasting your own time. People have even said in the past, it's like a second job finding a job.
Makes work.
So I think that a lot of what people are doing in that, just apply to as many places as possible and see what kind of comes back to you, is it's a way to do it, but is it the best way to do it? Probably not. And then what happens whenever the people, think that you're a superstar and they want to bring you in and they're excited about you, and then you kind of fall flat in the interview because you're not as excited? That's a good way to maybe burn a bridge with a company too. So
yeah, I think if you see yourself working for a company, you do a whole lot of research, or maybe you know about them, you have friends that work for them, you've heard great things, and you have this desire to work for this company, then there's probably going to be some increased pressure that you place on yourself in the interview room. But I would say that there should be a genuineness that comes across, an authenticity that you want to work for them, that you're excited, that there's excitement there. So, and if you go into an interview room that you're not excited about, it's kind of like, I guess if this is the only job I can get, it's going to come across that way. And on top of that, you don't want to be fake either. So you want to be genuine. So, do research on the internet. That's probably the easiest place that most of us go. But also I would say, some companies' websites are not maybe the most up to date, or the most realistic at what the company actually is, right? So companies will pay PR firms, or they'll have their own PR people that will portray a certain image that they want for the company to have externally. And a good company strives for that to not be hypocritical, for that to be the same externally as internally. Mm-hmm. But I would say no company is 100% accurate on how they portray themselves externally. There's some that are better than others, but it's rarely ever 100%. And so I would always say make sure that if you have peers or you know of people that work for these companies, to talk with them. And you're going to gain a lot of knowledge that should prepare you for the interview room there. Or you can just talk to people from the company. I mean, we're available. So if you wanted to know about Gerdau before your interview room, even if we're never going to interview you, you can talk to us, right?
I mean, that's where that messaging on LinkedIn kind of comes into play too, where, I mean, it's there for a reason. You can ask anybody any question that you have, really. I mean, the internet has really opened up the doors for everyone to access everyone a little bit easier in that respect for interviews. But, another thing that I think that we need to be kind of more cautious of on, the interviewee aspect is that, as Clinton said, there are often marketing firms and other places that are building these websites, and some of the information on it may not be as up to date. So whenever you're coming into the interview, I would say don't act like you know more about the company than the person working at the company. A lot of the times, you may have like a huge insight and like idea of what you want to do in your future, and that may have been expressed in a specific section of the website. However, the person interviewing you may not know anything about that section that you're trying to get into. Like, per se, Clinton sits in HR and I sit in product metallurgy. However, we both go interview, and I'm not going to know what, neither of us really are going to know exactly, what somebody's going to be working on in the maintenance department. So, but if you went and looked on our website, there's a whole bunch of like machinery in the backgrounds of the pictures and like all sorts of stuff like that. And if you were going to ask questions about that, we may not have answers for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want to come across like you're humble in the interview room. And, a common question in the interview room is, tell us what you know about us. What do you know about Gerdau, or what do you know about Walmart, or whoever you're interviewing with? And, you obviously want to do research ahead of time. Hopefully you do. That's a highly recommended thing for you to do. But you never want to come across and just regurgitate what you read, right? You don't want to just like memorize the mission and vision in huge 3 or 4 paragraphs and just regurgitate that. Because one, that doesn't come across genuine. That just comes across like you just read our website. But also it's okay to just say, hey, this is what I know. And then you say, I'd like to learn more, because that appeals to the company's or Gerdau's ego for us to talk about our company. And so hopefully the people you meet on the interview enjoy talking about their company, or at a career fair, hopefully those are people from the company that you're talking to that, allow them to talk about the company. It's an enjoyment. I enjoy talking about our company. So, that definitely can help in that regard. So next, kind of you have 2 different areas of things that we're kind of looking at, I would say, categorize in the interview. So when you're in the interview, the company is looking at 2 different aspects. And I would say every company is kind of weighing one side a little bit more than the other. But I would say overall, the interview room is defined how you do on the people side, or the soft skills, or the emotional intelligence side, because we can get a lot of your technical information via your resume, maybe even a background check, and just kind of spot checking you. And ultimately, if you're graduating from a university with a decent degree, like with a degree, mm-hmm. And it's not some crazy, weird online thing, something that's reputable, then obviously you have technical capability.
Yeah.
But I will say that some companies are going to lean a little bit more one way or the other. And even within the organization, you're going to see that. I think a great example is our maintenance department. And usually, whether it be a mechanic, electrician, an engineer that they bring in, they're going to kind of pressure check them and ask them some, I would say, basic technical questions. And that's okay. Like, it's a technical position, and the things that they're asking, they're things that they would hope the person would know coming in.
Yeah, I would say too that, one of the things that my boss stressed to me whenever I was applying for my position here at Gerdau was that remember, I have a background in ceramic engineering, and I'm now sitting in a metallurgy position. However, this umbrella of material science covers both of those. They're not as similar in techniques that you're going to be learning at school. And my boss really stressed to me that they were aware of the situation, that I maybe wouldn't have as much experience in the steel industry or with steel at all, and that they didn't really expect me to know much about that process coming into the interview. So, obviously I'm going to look into it a little bit to prepare, but they said that they were not going to innately set me up for failure during this interview.
Yep. It's really good. So, be ready for your technical, but also don't fake it, right? The technical, even more than the soft skill side, is that it's so easy to know whether or not you know your stuff on the technical side. I mean, somebody can just ask you a technical question, and if you try to BS it, usually the person who's asking that question knows the answer or is an expert in that field. So the last thing you want to do is, try to come up with an answer or chew around it.
I would say one of my prime examples of this was whenever we went out to dinner the night before my interview. One of my coworkers asked me what if I knew what the density of steel was, and I was like, I have no idea.
Exactly.
And I was like, but I do know that, relying on my limited amount of material science and steel, I was like, I do know that there are different types of steel. So I would assume that there is a range of densities that it is. And he was like, wow, yeah, that's a really good answer.
Yeah. So see, there's a way to be honest without necessarily failing the question, right? Yeah. So you can showcase, that would be a really good tip and that takes practice. That takes some confidence, I would say, to where if somebody asks you a technical question and you're able to answer it saying, I don't know, but I do know this, that's I would say expert level interviewing skills. And that's something to aspire to. And really that just takes confidence. Yeah. But really I would say, I'd say at Gerdau, at least for me, I'm in the interview room, I'm looking at maybe 35 to 40% technical and 60 to 65% on the soft people skills side. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is you can't necessarily get out of a resume or out of a degree who you are as an individual in regards to your personality, your culture, how you like to work, how you engage with people. And the interview room allows us to see that and glimpse in that and to really try to glean that out of the individual. And so whenever I'm doing interviews, I'm trying really hard to get that out of the individual, to really understand how is this person going to work on this team? Or really a lot of companies, it's how is this person going to work for me, because usually interview with your potential boss, or work on our team, and literally a whole team can interview somebody. So the key thing there is, be yourself. You don't want to come across, even though you may know the type of person the company wants. If you're not that type of person, then that is not who you should present yourself as. Now, this is a lot of self-retrospecting or looking inside yourself to determine who you are.
Right.
And maybe, I was talking with somebody yesterday, usually in college, particularly if you're a traditional college student, you're in your early 20s, that's a season of change for a lot of people. People are finding themselves. So it can be a challenge, but whoever you want to be, you're dictating that. that's who you need to be in the interview room, and you don't need to try to, portray yourself to somebody else.
Right. Because once, they start thinking that that's the person they're going to be hiring, and that's not who you are, that's probably not going to be a good fit for you on the personal side of that once you are hired and sitting in this role with all of these other people that do portray what you said that you did. And if you don't, then, I feel like that's when we're getting into the whole, turnover. Like you're not going to want to stay at that company.
Yep, exactly right. So it's a kind of a cliche word nowadays, but authenticity and being authentic is really important in the interview room. So let's go to our next point. So resume, we're going to have a video podcast in the next week or two dealing specifically on resumes, but your resume does drive most interviews. I'm not saying all, but most interviews, particularly ones that are with the actual team and not with a recruiter. When you're interviewing on site with a company, with your potential boss, with your potential manager, then they're going to be looking at your resume and asking you specific questions. Your resume, it's the classic go-to.
I would also say too that like the initial contact is also going to be resume driven, because whenever you're standing at a career fair or something, we're a lot of the times I would say companies are having you fill something out. We specifically hand you an iPad and have you fill stuff out. And while you're doing that, we're going to be looking at your resume and kind of seeing who you are, kind of what you do during that period of time. So,
yep. So it's real important to make sure that your resume is, I think, up to date. But specifically for the interview, you need to make sure that what's on your resume, it thoroughly in and out. It's almost like you have it memorized. You know what you've highlighted. You know what experiences you have on that resume, because that's what's going to be asked in an interview is tell me more about this.
Right. And then you can also assume that if you put it on your resume at all, somebody could ask a question about it. So like Clinton gave the example during our last talk of, if you list some random scholarship you got your freshman year and you're now a senior or, whatever, there's probably somebody sitting in the room that could potentially ask that question, may have received that scholarship, knows what work you had to do to get it. It's going to be one of those things that it could be a passion of the person sitting on the other side of the table that you have listed on your resume.
Yeah. It's I've seen it too many times in the interview room where I've asked somebody something about on their resume and they don't know it or don't know it that well.
Or they have to grab their resume back.
Yeah, that one's always bad. And I try to filter this through nerves. I do get it, and we get that people are nervous in the interview, but usually we can tell, if it's just nerves and whether or not you know what you're talking about. And so the next thing on here is like to list what you're passionate about. So it can be hard at times to put things on a resume to fill a resume, which I think that's probably a bad mentality to have. But you need to make sure that you list what you love to talk about. So if you had a project that you loved in college, you probably should put that on your resume, because maybe you just really liked everything about it. It's something that maybe you want to do in your career. And so you want to list that because that's what you want to talk about. You don't want to just list something because you think that might be what we want to see. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take that into consideration. Maybe you did have a project that deals with steel, or you did something with the metallurgy department. Not saying you shouldn't put that on there, but you should also put things on there that you're passionate about or that you really enjoyed.
Yeah. And I also think too that another thing that to remember is that if you didn't list it on your resume, doesn't mean that you can't state it as something that you're passionate about. Your resume isn't the incomplete book of who Adrienne Lister is. It's just a small snippet that is going to kind of tell the company who I am. Whereas, towards the end of my my tenure in college, I stopped listing that I was on the soccer team because, that wasn't really who I was anymore as a person, but that just because I didn't list it doesn't mean that I didn't do it. So.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then at the end is this idea of technical and people skill sets. So it's one of my pet peeves. We'll talk about it extensively in our resume video podcast of, what things do you list when it comes to skills? And, this is where what could really help is maybe you did take a number of classes in Java programming language, and you've done things with Java. Well, yeah, putting the word under skills, Java programming or C++ or .NET or SQL or something else, MATLAB, Minitab, Excel. But the key thing there is that you want to make sure that you are really knowledgeable about those things and you know how to use them, because somebody is going to ask you. So if you list, I've done it myself, somebody puts on their advanced Excel, and then I ask them, I'm like, okay, so tell me how you've used Excel. Give me a situation or give me a problem you have to solve with Excel. And it turns out it was just mainly putting some numbers in there and sorting them from largest to smallest. And I wouldn't necessarily call that advanced Excel, right? So you want to be genuine, but I will say that a lot of hiring managers and a lot of companies, particularly on the technical side, they're looking for, it's like, okay, this job requires extensive AutoCAD. So they're going to look for a resume that probably has the word AutoCAD on it. And then that's going to come up also in the interview. And probably, when it comes to on the people skill sets, well, how do you list those? Well, you probably don't want to just say team player, like this list of team player, hard worker, punctual, all these things, right? Like
that's just a good employee.
That's just a good employee. That's expected. But how you can highlight maybe some of your more soft skills or people skills is through the organizations or the projects or the programs or the classes that you have used those skill sets. I think extracurriculars are a great way to highlight your people skill sets. So if you're in a club or an organization, then that's where you'd want to list it at on there. And maybe you're the president of a fraternity or a sorority, and you'd list that. And then in the interview room, you can either bring it up, or we might bring it up in the interview room of, hey, tell us about this project you did with your sorority or fraternity. And in turn, that's where you're going to highlight your people skills.
Yeah. And I also would say too that, for the people skills aspect of it, I think that some people may, because we're talking about resumes, some people may have like a skills-based resume. And I think that those are, definitely something that you need to more portray in the interview rather than just list on your resume.
Yeah. I think it's a good way to put it.
That's because if you say that if you say that you're punctual on your resume and then you're late for your interview, that doesn't look very good.
Yep, that's exactly right. So spend more time, and I think that leads into probably one of our other points. We already talked about this. We won't spend a lot of time, but make sure that you're you, that authenticity is important in the room. Make sure when you're answering your questions, it's honestly how you would, because most interviews are situational questions. And so how you answer those situational questions, you need to make sure that that's how you honestly would handle those situations. Not exactly maybe how, I think most of us understand probably what a company may want to hear, but if that's not who you are, that's okay. Answer it how you would deal in that situation and say why.
Right.
And
I think another thing that a lot of people are scared of during the interview is, telling companies about times that you didn't succeed. And I think that comes along with authenticity is that we all know that we're all humans. And, Clinton and I as interviewers, we're not perfect. We haven't succeeded in every single project we've ever done at this company or any other, place in our lives. So I think that's just something that, obviously you're trying to put your best foot forward, everyone is, but at some point there's a point between putting your best foot forward and just flat out lying.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep.
And that's another thing too, is that a lot of the times when you are lying, you're going to be caught in that lie during the interviewing process. And it's very easy. I didn't think sitting on the other side of the table just a year ago. Up until the point where I was interviewing, I was like, how do they know? Like, how do they know that, how would they even know, And now that I am sitting on the other side of the table, it's like, wow, you do really know whenever, like, you can tell all of these aspects of this person just based on having a conversation with them for an hour or even 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's, and sometimes we use the word lying, like maybe somebody comes into the interview room purposely lying. I think it's more of you're just trying so hard to get the job that you're trying to portray yourself in what the company wants to see.
Right.
And there's a fine line there of making sure you put your best foot forward, but at the same time being true to yourself. And I think telling stories, and it's becoming, I try to ask in the interview room, I think more companies are. Failing is very important to, most companies today, is how you handle failure and how you move forward from failure. I think most people who are watching this get this, like, what did you learn and how did you grow from it and all that. And those are great ways to be, again, authentic, who you are, without coming across like as this super perfect 4.0 student that is always right, never wrong, perfection. And It's like, that doesn't exist. That's where I'm just thinking, medical schools now are even looking at, it used to, you had to have a 4.0 and you had to get this super like perfect grade on your exams to get in. And they're actually seeing like, well, these students never had to face any adversity. They never had to, grow and push through failure, because as a doctor, you're going to fail. So you have to learn how to build up from that. So they're looking at people with not maybe 4.0, but maybe like a 3.5 or a 3.75 or something like that. And they're looking for people who aren't perfect and exact. And I think that can show up in the interview room if you're authentic about who you are and the stories you have to say. So
I'd agree with that.
I think that's kind of the thing that I tell a lot of students about, and how to kind of sum up and understand how you should go in the interview. And I see it time and time again. When I first started doing university recruitment for the company, it was like a broken record. Every time I'd go into the interview room, it was the same thing happening again. And what was happening was we kept asking the situational question about, tell us a time when you had to deal with a difficult person, or when you didn't necessarily, you wanted to go one way and somebody else wanted to go another way. And we kept hearing the same story. And I'm going to let Adrienne tell it. And she's going to say it in the worst way, this example in the worst way possible.
So let me think of a time that I had to deal with a difficult person. And then they'll pause for about a minute or two, because it's like they're not expecting the question, even though it's almost asked in every single interview I think I've ever been in. But They will go, well, it was in college, and we were working on a lab project or a group project of some sort, and there were a couple people on the team. One person wasn't pulling their weight, and we talked to them, and they never responded. And in the end, we ended up getting a good grade on the project.
Yeah, and as sad as it sounds, that's usually how the story's told. Like, there isn't a lot of detail. There's not a lot of information. We don't even really know how you dealt with a difficult person, other than they called them or emailed them, and that was it. And
you succeeded.
And you succeeded on top of that. You didn't fail. That's the key point. You always come out ahead on that project. You got a good grade. And I heard it. I hear it every year. I hear it in the interview every semester, all the time. And it just drives me nuts. And it's just, and the way I describe it, I think, is that we're not storytelling. We're not telling we're not speaking in the interview room like we'd be talking to our best friend. And I get that. You don't want to necessarily use a lot of slang and be cussing and all that kind of stuff. But you need to tell that story, that experience, just like you'd be telling your best friend, albeit a little more refined.
More professional.
More professional, right? And the best way to get into the details, it's like, okay, tell us the people's names. Tell us the project in detail that you're working on. Tell us times. Tell us the teacher's name. And, and I know there's maybe some fear of like, well,
what if you're interviewing this person?
Yeah. We could care less.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as you're not like bad mouthing, degrading somebody, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, that would be a personality problem, culture problem that you have. If you're just saying, you know what, Adrienne, so I was on this group project in ceramic engineering in my ceramics class, and we were doing this in this lab, and I'm going to be talking in generalities, but you're going to talk about the specific project that you're doing.
We were building superconductors, and Clinton just kept missing our lab time that we were scheduled for, and he kept saying that he showed up later in this period of time, and we emailed him telling him every time that we were going to meet, and he never responded, but then would say, I didn't see your email. I had to walk my dog, or I had a doctor's appointment, or my boyfriend is sick, or whatever.
Yep. Yep.
And then, we went and had a face-to-face conversation with him like a week after this problem began, and he didn't even want to show up for that. So at the end, we had to resort to talking to Dr. So-and-so. And, and I think that it potentially adversely affected the amount of work that we could get done as a group. But in the end, we did pass the class. But, it was a struggle during that period of time. And I think that maybe we could have gotten a better result had the entire team not had to focus on this person's adverse reaction.
Yeah, there we go. It's hard to put on the spot. Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to so then it's like, okay, then what is Gerdau wanting to hear from that story? Well, we heard the idea of the progression there, right? That there's this idea of you progress in your conflict resolution, right? And we even teach that in new employee orientation. I teach that. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking for in this story. And when you're telling details, that tells us that you remember it, that you understand from it, and that you learn from it. Because if it truly was a difficult situation, it impacts you. I think, I don't have that many. I probably only have a handful of true situations where I had to deal with somebody that was difficult. And it impacted me. I can think of those people. I can think of those times where I can tell those stories today and tell how I grew from them and learned from them. And that's what you need to talk about and speak of, and speak in specifics, like I said, names, dates.
Yeah, I would even say, obviously we're trying to talk more general right now because we don't want to tell our examples, but I would say that even more specific than what we just said just now, because you want to, that's another way to think about it too, is you're trying to draw your interviewer into this story. You're trying to really, these storytelling opportunities are opportunities for them to see your personality and how you shine. And, you can incorporate all different parts of your life into this period of time that they're telling. You don't even have to stay on the track of this one story. As a true storyteller, you could jump from point A to point B to come back to circle around to the end,
Yeah, exactly. I think the idea that you're drawing people in, again, I just look at it as you're telling your best friend what happened that day, and you just want to bring them into that situation. So think of it like that. I think that's probably the best way. And this isn't just in a difficult situation, but this applies to when we ask you tell us about this project that you listed on your resume, or tell us about, I would say anytime we ask you to tell us about a time or tell us about this, or tell us this, that should trigger in your mind a story.
Right. I think that any open-ended question you should be able to answer with a story, really. And I feel as though in an interview, you're not going to be asked many like yes questions, or, I think some of the more technical questions you're not going to be able to answer with a story, but definitely those personality, questions. They're trying. There's nothing worse than interviewing somebody that you're like, it's like pulling teeth to get them to give you more information.
Yeah. And we understand on the company side of things, on like Gerdau side, I understand going into an interview room, there's going to be nerves. It's going to be hard. We have to try to make the room comfortable, try to ease the stress, the pressure. And so it gets to a point to where, okay, we're totally willing to try to help bring these stories out of you. Mm-hmm. But there does come a point where I'm trying too hard.
Right. I think there's that point where it's, I wouldn't say it's like a switch where it's like a lack of interest almost on my part. It's like, all right, if they're not going to tell me, mm-hmm. I guess we'll just move on.
Yep, exactly. And you want, the interview room to be, it's kind of interesting to be like a two-way street, right? You want, when you're telling your story, usually somebody in the interview room, at Gerdau, when you come on site, we usually have a panel interview with multiple individuals. Usually somebody's going to build on your story. Again, no different than in your social circle with your friends. You're telling a story, and then somebody else wants to chime in and tell their, like, either their part of the story or how they had a similar story, or right. I had that happen and that sucks, and build on it, Mm-hmm. And so that allows, again, this idea of storytelling to just make the interview room more rich, more interesting, and more enjoyable.
And I think that is kind of what I said in the last session, was that's a good sign of an interview, is that you kind of felt like you kind of put the resume aside, you just had a conversation with somebody. Mm-hmm. It didn't really matter what it was about, but I feel like every time that I have walked out of an interview, if I felt like it was more of an interview, I felt like I didn't do very well. And if I felt like, I would go grab a coffee with them afterwards, like to continue our conversation, that it went pretty well. So
yeah, I like you bringing up coffee. I mean, there's some companies now, we don't necessarily do that in Gerdau. Maybe we will, maybe I'll try it out. Yeah. But there's a lot of smaller company startups. If you went to Silicon Valley, their interview is essentially going and getting coffee and having a conversation, kind of like a first date,
right?
Just getting to know the person. And so that's becoming more traditional or more common. So
I would say even with my boss, our first, like after, the initial career fair interview, the screening interview that my boss did, he pretty much just asked me, like, we went to the same university, and it kind of felt like he was just asking me about what was going on in school, because it was his alma mater, and it's, now my alma mater. So that's something that we have in common, that he knew that we could have a lot to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, let's go on to the next one. So storytelling, it's important. So last, I think it goes without saying, you can plan, you can practice for your interview. This is the idea of, use technology, research, you can even record yourself and play it back if you really wanted to. I mean, I remember practicing my elevator speech in front of my mirror in my apartment in college. Okay. All my roommates, we did it, and that's okay. Like, that's planning, that's practicing. I would just say, you want to be comfortable, but not rehearse robotic.
Yeah. I feel like my approach is definitely more of a kind of wing it person, because if I feel like, so I was telling Clinton earlier before we did this too, I was like, I don't know if our examples are going to be as good. Like, I'm worried. I'm definitely more of a on the spot person. And I think that comes out in my interviews as well, is like, if I rehearse it too often, then I feel like I sound like not myself. And I think that that's the worst thing for me personally, because I would say that coming into interviews, like, my resume wasn't as strong, as like I didn't have as much experience, I would say, like in the technical aspect. And so where I know that I shine more is when my personality gets to show, and I get to show how passionate I am about what I want to do. And I think that if I sound rehearsed, that it doesn't come across very well.
Yeah. And, I think both Adrienne and I would say we're both extroverts. So I want to make sure that I want to give tips and tricks for maybe the little more introverts or not extroverts out there, is that, again, you should have friends. If you don't, get some friends or get a friend
or program a friend,
I guess. But I think that's probably the best way to practice and plan is just talk with your friend about your stories and your experiences that you want to talk about in the interview room. It may be a little weird, but hopefully you have a close enough relationship and make it a two-way street. I think the other thing there is to think differently. And what I mean by that, it's a cliche, is think about those stories. The common question that is like, well, how do you make sure that you separate yourself from other candidates in the interview room? Well, go back to those stories and experiences that you have that are unique to you. We just gave you the most generic, difficult situation story that every college student has. So maybe think of a different difficult situation that you've been in. It doesn't have to be, I haven't stressed this, your experiences and things that you bring into the interview room don't have to be directly related to college.
Yeah.
I think that's a common, I guess, bucket or trap that people get into, is that, well, my experience has to be during college. No, it can be in, with friends and situations. Maybe in a difficult situation, you were hiking or you were doing something outside on a boat and your friend wanted to do this and you're like, no, we can't do that. That's not safe.
Right.
We got to do it. You have to wear those life vests, and you got into an argument, maybe even a fist fight about it.
Yeah.
And, that showcases one, think of it. We're really big on safety here at Gerdau. So there's a way to talk about a different situation that deals with safety, and that unique story, we're going to remember it in the interview room. So when I say think differently, think about those stories that are unique to you and not that every other college student has.
I think Clinton brought this up in the last one too, was that one of the things that sticks out in his mind is the story that I told about working at a liquor store for my difficult situation, and, dealing with all the different types of people that you would think that would come into a liquor store is definitely something that kind of speaks to how well you deal with people in a daily basis, especially in a steel mill setting where, you're going to have operators all the way up to, your plant manager that you're going to deal with on your daily basis too. So it's just getting those different parts of, what you're doing. And you don't have to have the most, amazing job ever to be able to tell that. You could, you don't have to be a hipster in your extracurricular activity.
Yeah, like I'll give it. I'm just thinking of a good story. Is I worked at the housing office where I went to college, and I remember getting multiple phone calls of irate parents wanting to know about their students. But because their kid is over 18, there's legal things, protections on an 18-year-old once they're in college, that I can't just flat out give information to somebody's parent, particularly if they're paying for their rent at our on-campus apartment complex. And so those are difficult stories. Those are unique. But that job was pretty mundane, I'm just taking calls, office desk job, right? But everything, you can find something. So when you're planning and practicing ahead, you just have to kind of reflect, think through, I don't know, go through your Facebook feed for the past couple of years and think of something, or your Twitter feed or something, to find if you can't remember anything. Or maybe, again, talk to your friends, use your friends and family and say, hey, can you guys remember when I went through a tough situation in my life, or dealing with somebody in a tough situation? Do you guys remember something? Or you can ask your friend, did we ever get into a fight or a difficult situation?
Yeah, I think a lot about the interview is, I feel like we all live our lives like what's happening here and now, And I think that's what people are wanting from your interview, is you to take the blinders off and for you to tell, the whole story of you, because they only have an hour to get to know you for the most part. So I think that that's an important aspect, is to kind of, you're not just a college student. You are, a college student that also grew up in X city doing, whatever you like to do whenever you grow up, like how all of these things made you who you are.
Yeah, that's a really great way to kind of conclude it. So it's about you. We're kind of into that 100% you telling stories about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we have any more slides.
I think it's
the last one. And I want to make sure, this is the thing we don't want to happen. An interview can be just two people lying to each other for 2 hours or an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
The company can be disingenuous, and we portray what we talked about earlier on the PR side of like a fake representation of ourselves. And then also the interviewer can, or interviewee can portray themselves as somebody who they're not. And we're just trying to, give this idealized perfect of each other. And I think telling stories can help keep this from happening, because it kind of lowers there has to be a right answer to these questions.
All right. It lowers the formality, I think, too.
And I'll say this, there are still companies out there that have a more formal interview. I think in Gerdau, we've tried, and some of our locations are better than others, to try to shy away from the super formality in an interview.
Yeah.
But there are still some companies out there that are a little more formal, and they like the pressure check in the interview room. They want you to sweat a little bit. Maybe that's their culture. It probably is their culture, because maybe the type of culture they have in their company, because of maybe the pressure or whatever they've determined. Mm-hmm. If you go into I would say kind of one of the advice on that, when I've had a student ask me, if you go into an interview room like that, if you don't enjoy it, then it kind of goes back to that very first slide. Then why would you ever want to work for a company like that?
Right.
If you go into the interview room and it's a pressure check and it's intimidating and it's not, friendly and from that standpoint, then maybe you don't need to work for that company if you're not aligned with that. Or maybe you are. You're totally cool with that. You love that kind of maybe a little bit more militaristic pressure, traditional aspect, and that's A-okay. That tells you there's an alignment, in the cultures.
I would also say, too, as just a point of information, a lot of companies, based on kind of laws and stuff for interviewing, have to ask they have to ask everyone all of the same questions. And so maybe if, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you get cut off while you're giving an answer because they're short on time and have to move on. I think that is just legally something that a lot of companies expect them to get through all of the same questions for all of the people they're interviewing.
Yeah. To give you insight, so from an HR standpoint, obviously there's laws that keep. I should have talked about these things. We didn't talk about these in the first one, so we're going to talk about them here. There's kind of some laws in place that protect the interviewee, and that the interviewer can ask. So there's laws that keep us from asking about are you married? Do you have kids? And those things that we can't. And the idea is we can't discriminate you in hiring practices, which is a good thing. I will say this doesn't mean that the interviewee can't talk about those things. So when we were talking about stories, if you are aware that you shouldn't talk about those things, whether it be you're active in your church, because obviously we can't hire you based on religious affiliation, or we can't hire you based on maybe a medical condition that you have. But those are your stories. You can still tell us those stories, and we legally can't use that against you.
Right.
Now, that isn't to say that you could tell us those things and then we don't hire you for more real things, right?
Right.
So you have to get that out of your mind that, I told them the story that I had cancer and they didn't hire me because, there's a risk because they're cancer patients. We legally can't do that.
Right.
And so if you're worried about that in your storytelling, you don't need to worry about that. You're protected by federal law. And then the other thing, to Adrienne's point, there's two reasons why we ask all the same questions. One of them is to be fair and just in our interviewing practices. That way, there can't be anybody who says, well, you asked these questions, but you didn't ask these questions over here. That is a pretty low risk, but some companies who are risk adverse in their hiring practices do that. And then the other thing is this is more of an engineering side, is this idea that we want to be able to compare apples to apples. And so if we're asking every group of students different questions, how can we compare? And so if we're asking at least similar questions, even though there's different stories, at least there's some level of comparison between the two.
Right.
And that's just good HR practices in general. That can be hard sometimes because of time constraints, but that's kind of some insights to why you see some of that structure, or why you'll see the company try to shy away from, maybe if you're starting to talk about something that they're not comfortable with, they'll try to shy away from that. It's because there's legal protections that you have as an individual. Right. I even know this is pretty crazy insight. I know everybody's into LinkedIn right now, and LinkedIn's great. But companies even have to be careful about pictures, because we can't hire you based obviously on your appearance.
Right.
And so there's a danger sometimes with LinkedIn. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have your picture on LinkedIn. I'm totally an advocate of having a very robust LinkedIn profile. You go see mine as a justification for that. But, the company, you just have to, some companies, they may not even use LinkedIn or go on LinkedIn. I know, when it comes to a lot of the positions in Gerdau, they'll shy away from that because they want to protect themselves from any type of discrimination lawsuit, because, well, you didn't give me that interview. I saw that you looked on my LinkedIn profile, and I saw, and I know my friend looked over here, and you probably thought that she more aligned with, your culture because of how she looked or how she appeared. So you hired her instead of me. Like, there's people out in the world that think that, but I'm not saying that can't happen, but
yeah, I think another thing on that point too of like the HR laws and stuff is a lot of the times I keep seeing more recently, and I feel like because I went to Missouri S&T, I know that they kind of shy away from telling people to do this, is that I keep seeing people putting their pictures on their resume. And I understand where that sentiment is coming from, but it's also kind of makes it very difficult for us to kind of keep it in mind that, not everyone has their picture on their resume. So I'm trying, as it is a good way to remember who you were and, having that conversation with that person, it is also, your appearance on your resume. And it's, I would say, more difficult for the company to abide by those laws whenever you're doing that, and that's putting extra strain on us as employers.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't. We'll get on that resume. I probably wouldn't put my picture on my resume.
Yeah.
It's an ink waster, and a company should evaluate you on who you are, not on how you look.
Yeah.
And that's easier said than done. Because again, we had a guy in our HR, he was spending some time down here. This is a good story. And this was for our hourly positions. And we'll interview 20, 25 people in a week for our hourly positions. And you can just imagine it can be really hard to remember who people are with just a name. And so I remember he was taking pictures. He would just take, and he was taking just this cheap camera and the most unflattering pictures, so nobody's really going to get, from this idea of somebody's getting that glamour shot or not.
Right.
But I remember as soon as my boss found it, she was like, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
Just because we just don't want to bring any bias into the picture. And so we're trying as an HR, as Adrienne said, as a company, to do our best to remove any bias. And so we're trying our hard to just be good, ethical HR people. So hopefully we answered your questions, even though you didn't have a chance to ask them in this one. There were some decent questions. I think we covered most of those questions in this video. I think there was a couple other ones, but if you have any questions, you definitely can reach out to us via LinkedIn with our names. But also, we haven't decided what platform we're going to post this on. I'll figure that out. But obviously, I'm sure you'll be able to either like and subscribe or comment on the video if you have any thoughts about this. So,
and obviously, we want to keep doing this for your benefit too. So, if you have ideas and topics that you want us to be talking about, please let us know.
Yep. And shout out to our 4 main universities that we kind of engage with, the UA Fort Smith, University of Arkansas, Arkansas Tech, and Missouri S&T. Thank y'all. Have a great day.